In today's episode, I spoke with historian and author Chad Williams. We spoke about his new book, The Wounded World, W.E.B. Du Bois and the First World War. Chad is a professor of history and African American studies at Brandeis University. He is the author of the award-winning book, Torchbearers of Democracy, African American Soldiers in the World War I Era, and he is the co-editor of Charleston Syllabus, Readings on Race, Racism, and Racial Violence. His writings and op-eds have appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Time, and The Conversation. In this conversation, I spoke with Chad about W.E.B. Du Bois and his status as a larger-than-life figure and spokesman for the African American community during the 20th century. We talked about Du Bois's view on the philosophy of identity, specifically his idea of double consciousness. We talked about the role of Black Americans in World War I, as well as Du Bois's overall thoughts on World War I as a whole, and maybe more importantly, the causes of World War I, which in his view never ended up being addressed and led to another war, of course. We talked about W.E.B. Du Bois and his views on democracy, the connection between race, capitalism, socialism, and the labor movement of the early 20th century. We discussed the Great Migration and the impacts that this had on American society, as well as the racial violence directed at African Americans during this time period. We discussed the role of Woodrow Wilson in World War I, as well as his views on race in America. We talked about the Pan-African Conference taking place around the time period of World War I and the impact of that, as well as Du Bois's efforts to chronicle the story of Black soldiers in World War I as a historian. Finally, we discussed Du Bois's ultimate legacy, his mistakes, regrets, failures, but also his triumphs and contributions to the world and how he should be remembered. I really enjoyed this one, and I hope you do as well. Thanks for listening. Hey, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I really appreciate it. I usually don't read too much history, centered around like one person, but I feel like the way you wrote this made it feel like it was, there was so much context going on in relation to Du Bois. Was that something you were thinking about as you wrote it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, initially when I started this project, I guess over 10 years ago when I started writing, but I mean, the genesis goes back to like 2000. I was hesitant to really make it about Du Bois because it's so much history to tell, so much context, as you say. But I realized that Du Bois obviously had to be at the center of the story. But in doing so, I wanted to make it clear that he's a part of a much larger history, and that his efforts to wrestle with, to reckon with the history, the legacies of World War I is really the story of African Americans and other peoples of African descent throughout much of the 20th century.
I mean, I definitely wanted to ask you about that, so maybe we could start there. So what was it about your experience with history and, the way you think about history? What led you to Du Bois, and what led you specifically to that World War I time period where, as you said, to you, that seems like a significant moment for all of history and particularly African-American history?
Yeah, for myself as a scholar of African American studies, Du Bois is such a important figure. I still vividly remember the first time I read The Souls of Black Folk in college, my freshman year. And it was just such an eye-opening experience. And thinking through that text, thinking through the ideas that are in that text really shaped my approach to studying African American history and to studying Black life more broadly. And that was really my entryway into studying Du Bois and just the huge corpus of scholarship that he produced. I initially was interested in studying a period that Du Bois spent a lot of time studying, the Civil War and Reconstruction. And kind of through my research and interest in that period, I began to look at the World War One era, to think about the ways in which African Americans were still engaged in a struggle over the meanings of democracy, the ways that they used war and military service to stake claim to their citizenship rights, thinking specifically about the experiences of African American soldiers and veterans. And it was kind of through that project, which became my first book, that I encountered Du Bois again, and really the central role that he played in thinking about how African Americans should approach the war, and ultimately writing about the war, discovering this unfinished and unpublished manuscript that Du Bois spent 2 decades really laboring and agonizing over, and never finished.
Right. So Du Bois is such an interesting guy. As you write about in the book, he grew up through probably the peak of the Jim Crow era. He saw 2 world wars. He saw European imperialism. He saw colonialism. He saw communism and the beginnings of the Cold War. And he really is this larger than life figure.
Yeah.
I'd like to get your thoughts, but it seemed to me like in reading the book that he almost viewed himself as sort of a spokesman for not just African Americans, but also increasingly, as his life went on, Black people across the world. Would you say that's sort of an accurate characterization?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Du Bois, really from a very young age, saw himself as striving to be a spokesman for the race, to being a example of the possibilities of Black people for certainly educational and intellectual excellence, but for freedom and equality as well. So really, beginning during his college years, he saw his calling in life as to be a representative of the race and the equality of Black people, not just in the United States, but worldwide. And he carried that sense of commitment, that sense of vocation with him throughout his entire life. And I think that's one of the things that makes Du Bois so remarkable. I mean, he lived 95 years, from really the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, all the way up to the modern civil rights movement. And throughout that entire time, 9 decades, his commitment, his belief in Black people, in Black freedom, in democracy, never wavered.
Yeah, and I think it's as you point out, it's not just that he's living through these moments and sort of seeing himself as a spokesperson, but he's actually making serious contributions to history and philosophy and sociology. And I wondered if maybe you could speak to one thing in particular that I'm interested in as someone who is interested in sort of philosophy of identity, his idea of double consciousness. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit and how that fits in with Du Bois and the First World War.
Right. So Du Bois, he was a interdisciplinary scholar par excellence. He studied at Harvard with some of the most kind of luminous scholars and intellectuals of the day in history, philosophy, sociology, religion, studied at the University of Berlin, which was kind of seen as the pinnacle of kind of higher education at the time. So he's pulling from all these different influences in the United States as well as abroad to kind of formulate his own idea of what it means to be Black, his own idea of Black identity, which is pulled from Dewey, which is pulled from Kant, from Goethe, from all these different religious, philosophical, educational influences, to formulate what he describes as double consciousness, this tension between being Black on the one hand and being American on the other, what he describes in The Souls of Black Folk as these two warring ideals, these two unreconciled strivings. And he really approaches World War I as an opportunity to almost put theory into practice. Now, here is this moment where African Americans have the chance to really test if they will be seen and treated as full and equal citizens by risking their lives, by demonstrating their loyalty and ultimately risking their lives on the battlefield. So he's viewing World War One, harkening back to kind of the historical legacies of Black military service, going back to the American Revolution, certainly rooted in the Civil War, as this test of whether or not African Americans can reconcile their double consciousness in the heated throes of war and combat, and ultimately he has to kind of reckon with the repercussions of that decision.
Yeah, so he sees this as an opportunity. First of all, in the early 1900s in America, I think some people might think, okay, racism, slavery, and all that stuff ends after the Civil War and with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. But, the reality is, that's not really the case at all, particularly in the South. And he's hoping that by fighting in the war and by contributing to the war effort, that's going to essentially pave the way for full citizenship and equal opportunity and all these things. But there's also other people in the Black community that don't see it that way, which I think is something interesting that you point out in the book. Maybe you could describe the debate as to, how involved in World War One, that whole process was.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that African Americans have never been monolithic in their views about civil rights, about the best way to go about the struggles for Black citizenship and equality. And that was certainly demonstrated during World War One. I mean, you have individuals like Du Bois representing a certain segment of the Black population, arguing that we are American citizens and first and foremost, we need to support our country. On the other hand, you have other African Americans like A. Philip Randolph, Chandler Owen, Hubert Harrison, who are very clear that fighting for the United States should not come at the expense of fighting for your rights, fighting for your dignity as not just as an American, but as a human being. So you do have very intense debates taking place during the war and even afterwards, about the decision to support the war, if it was the right decision, which again I think speaks to the much larger issue that African Americans are still grappling with today in many respects. How do you go about supporting a country that oftentimes does not support you, that does not respect you as a citizen and even as an equal human being?
Right. And then ultimately, we do see Black soldiers fighting for America in World War One. And part of what you're writing about here is Du Bois's effort to sort of chronicle that experience and figure out what was happening over on the battlefields of Europe. And what he finds out is pretty interesting, of course. So maybe you could describe the experience of the Black soldier during World War One.
Sure. So there were approximately 380,000 African American soldiers who fought and labored in World War One. Roughly 200,000 served in France. The majority were service of supply troops, labor troops, stevedores, loading and unloading ships, digging ditches, burying dead bodies, all the ugly, unglamorous work of the war. But you did have two Black combat divisions. One of those combat divisions had Black officers, and Du Bois was deeply invested in their success, in demonstrating that Black men as officers had the capability to lead, and that Black soldiers more broadly could be effective fighters on the combat field. Again, demonstrating through blood sacrifice that African Americans were indeed full and equal citizens, and as a result deserved increased citizenship rights when the war was over. When Du Bois goes to France immediately after the armistice, and in the book I talk about all the ways that he kind of manipulated his way to get over there. He's really shocked by what he sees, just the incredible amounts of racism, the abuse that African American soldiers received. It was really disheartening and disillusioning for Du Bois on a personal level, because he had really wagered his own credibility in calling for African Americans to close ranks and to forget their special grievances, to support the American war effort. He put his own credibility, sacrificed his own principles, right? So his name was on the line in many ways. And what he witnessed firsthand in France, talking to Black soldiers and officers, experiencing their pain and frustration firsthand, really was shocking, and really steeled his determination to write the history of the war, and to do so in a way that was brutally honest, that on the one hand reclaimed the heroism of Black soldiers and what they contributed to in the war, but also exposed the incredible amounts of institutionalized racism in the American army.
You describe in the book where, much like a lot of people after the war who go to visit these battlefields, you walk in the trenches and you walk through the totally shredded up and disfigured fields, and he has these powerful moments where he feels like this is a story that needs to be told. Yeah. And he feels like it's important, not just because of, again, just the African American experience, but the broader context of World War I. And I think he is, you might be able to speak to this, of course, but he seems to me to be ahead of his time as far as assessing what World War I really meant and what the causes of it were, from an economic perspective, from an imperial perspective. Right. Whereas back in the day, people are largely looking at this as, simply a matter of German aggression. Du Bois is seeing this as, economic exploitation, imperialism, and this broader economic context that is creating social issues that need to be resolved.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's incredibly clairvoyant. I mean, as early as 1914, 1915, he writes, a seminal piece in the Atlantic Monthly, "The African Roots of War," and he's identifying, the imperial origins of the war, but also specifically linking it to the exploitation of Africa and other places in what he describes as the darker world. And he was very much ahead of his time, advancing arguments that scholars today are still, trying to make sense of and articulate. But he's also, recognizing that if the roots of the World War were not addressed, if the problem of colonialism and imperial exploitation and white supremacy was not addressed, then what happened in the First World War was going to happen again. So he's also anticipating the possibility of a Second World War, which of course comes to fruition.
I wanted to ask you about that too. You have a couple of sections in the book describing, I think it's like 1936 or 1937, and Du Bois is basically going on, a vacation through Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union and Imperial Japan.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So here you are in the 1930s, a Black American in Nazi Germany. And
during the Olympic Games at that.
Yeah. So what was the significance of that, for Du Bois, and also for how he saw where the future was going at that time?
Yeah, I think it's a really pivotal moment in his life. Du Bois always loved to travel. He traveled throughout the world, and he was certainly very hungry to get to Europe and Asia as well, to really see how the world had evolved since the First World War throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s, specifically to try and make sense of the meaning of democracy, the development of fascism in in Germany, the development of communism in the Soviet Union. So he was really interested in seeing up close, how these different theories of government, had evolved. And he comes away from this remarkable experience of being in Germany for several months, of traveling through the Soviet Union, of going to Imperial Japan, of spending time in China, and really seeing the seeds of the Second World War, right? Of seeing up close how the problems that had been attempted to be resolved during the First World War had only been exacerbated, and that a Second World War was all but inevitable. And I think that also kind of, on the one hand, kind of steeled his determination to try and write the history of the First World War as a warning call, right? As an attempt to let the world know what could potentially happen if another world war happens again. But it also deepened his disillusionment with World War One and its outcomes.
So why do you think that was, that he viewed democracy not just as, a better form of government than some of these other alternatives, but he also viewed it as, maybe I'm interpreting this wrong, but it seemed like he's viewing this as sort of the solution for a lot of racial issues and social issues and economic issues that are going on at the time. Why does he view democracy as sort of the goal?
Yeah, I think Du Bois, and he lived such a long life, and his views evolve. His views about the meaning of democracy evolve. But I think the seeds for Du Bois's faith and belief in democracy were really implanted at a very young age, when he's growing up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, kind of experiencing small d democracy up close. And he's a product of his times. He's a product of an age in which democracy was seen as the best form of government, but also as a way of thinking. I mean, he touched upon so many different aspects of American life and thought, and he really saw democracy not simply as a form of government, but as a way of living, as a way of navigating through the world, as a way of interacting with your fellow human beings. He saw democracy in a almost kind of philosophical and even spiritual context as well. And even as his views evolve throughout the 1930s and 40s and 50s, as he moves further to the left, as he embraces communism, he still has an abiding belief in democracy as a way of living, but ultimately as a way of connecting with the world and the people in it.
I wanted to ask about this. I think the idea of sort of multiple threads going on in the early 20th century, where you have, economic concerns, you have obviously racial inequality, you have labor struggles and labor strife, and you sort of have and of course, the imperialism and the world wars, and all these things are happening at once. So I wanted to ask you, and it's kind of a big question, but what do you see as the connection between somebody like Du Bois and something like socialism or communism, where you have these, I don't know if this question is making sense, but like, what is the connection between racial equality, socialism, and this labor movement that's happening at the time period? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely a big question. I mean, Du Bois always, as you can say, considered himself to be a socialist. He was briefly a member of the Socialist Party in the early 20th century. So he always recognized the relationship between race and capitalism, of the need for African Americans and other peoples of African descent to have economic equality, the connection between racial oppression and racial capitalism. Even going back to his doctoral thesis on the slave trade, really seeing how kind of the economic exploitation of Black people kind of laid the foundations for the development of race and white supremacy throughout the 19th and into the 20th century. So Du Bois, over a long period of time, continually kind of refines his ideas, his thinking in this regard. He's initially kind of very skeptical of revolutionary Marxism, of the Communist Party in the United States in particular, seeing them as taking advantage of African Americans, kind of exploiting their vulnerability for their own gain. So he's recognizing how race is still a kind of dividing point, a flashpoint when it comes to the struggle between Black workers and white workers, right? The investment of white workers in their whiteness, serving as a barrier, for true working class equality and solidarity. So he's kind of very skeptical of the Communist Party and its effectiveness because of its inability to address the realities of race. In the context of the Great Depression, his views move further to the left. He kind of embraces socialism more explicitly, the importance of African Americans forming economic cooperatives, finding opportunities to collaborate with white workers, both in the United States as well as internationally, and eventually, his views move even further to the left, where he ultimately begins to embrace, communism in a more formal sense. But it's certainly a lifelong journey for Du Bois to embrace kind of revolutionary socialism and Marxism in the very explicit way that he does, certainly by the late 1950s and early 1960s.
The idea there is that, for 300 or 400 years or however long it was, the worldwide economy was centered on imperialism or colonialism, right? Which is the extraction of labor and resources and, oppression of people in Africa, people in the Americas. So it would make sense that there's a connection between, racial concerns and economic ones. Mm-hmm. And, maybe a sort of concrete example that you give in the book would be what we call the Great Migration. So I wonder if you could speak to that and the effects that had on society and how that all kind of ties in with this time period in history.
Absolutely. So migration is such a central part of the Black experience. World War I, so important for a whole host of reasons, but especially for the demographic changes that the World War brought to the United States. The opportunity of African Americans to leave the South, the lure of jobs in the North, in the Midwest, in cities like Chicago, New York, Pittsburgh, Detroit, other places, but also the conditions that African Americans were facing in the South, right? The near slavery-like conditions that many African Americans, particularly those who were sharecroppers, continued to endure, combined with the virulent racism and racial violence that they had to deal with on a daily basis. Those factors, those push and pull factors, really shaping one of what Du Bois at the time recognized, one of the most momentous social movements in African American history, where nearly 500,000 African Americans from the South relocate to the North, and really dramatically changing the demographic composition of Black America, but also the social, cultural, and political conditions of Black America as well. And it's certainly not a coincidence that in the context of the Great Migration, or the first Great Migration during the World War I period, you have this upsurge in political activism as well, in New York, in Chicago, the emergence of the New Negro movement, right, which I talk about in the book. This desire on the part of African Americans to kind of stake claim to their freedom and their rights. Doing so with their feet. Relocating to the north, and then finding organizations and other avenues to express their desires for freedom and equality.
Yeah, and a lot of that may be being fueled by what is really some crazy racial violence that's going on during this time period. St. Louis and Tulsa and Chicago. I think a lot of people may not be sort of fully aware of what was going on and why those types of things were happening, and what the impact of all that was. So maybe you could speak to some of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, as Du Bois is trying to wrestle with the legacies of the war, African Americans are almost in a second war after the war. The war continues for them. You have horrific racial violence taking place during the war in East St. Louis in 1917, but the Red Summer of 1919, where you have race riots, massacres, pogroms taking place throughout the country, from Washington, D.C., African Americans being beaten and killed literally right in front of the White House while Woodrow Wilson is sitting inside doing nothing. In Chicago, where you have full-blown battles taking place in the street, to Arkansas, where you have white mobs, killing hundreds of African American farmers and sharecroppers. This was a period of incredible turmoil, of bloodshed, of trauma, and again, further caused Du Bois and other African Americans to question, whether or not their sacrifice during the war was worthwhile. I think it's a reminder of just the centrality of racial violence in American history. I mean, how we can really trace the struggles of Black people for freedom and racial justice throughout this country's history, through a continuing thread of racial violence. Certainly beginning, in the antebellum period with slavery, but as we've unfortunately seen, continuing today as well.
So you mentioned Woodrow Wilson there, sort of in the context of this racial violence and, of course, segregation. And, he's sort of a figure in history that has, had a number of different perspectives on him, and I think I can tell your opinions on him based on the book. But what are your overall thoughts on Woodrow Wilson, and what were Du Bois's thoughts on Woodrow Wilson at the time?
Yeah, Du Bois was initially very fond, even hopeful of Woodrow Wilson. In the book, I try and trace, their development kind of simultaneously, and in some ways they were kind of kindred spirits. I mean, they were both kind of these highbrow intellectuals. They both had a deep faith and belief in democracy, obviously from very different vantage points, very different backgrounds. But I think their similarities in some ways were really quite telling. And Du Bois, when Woodrow Wilson initially ran for president, supported him, made the very kind of bold, even controversial decision to throw his support behind Woodrow Wilson. As a Democrat, that's something that African Americans were not doing. Still, we're very much tethered to the Republican Party. But Du Bois's decision to support Woodrow Wilson in 1912 immediately came to be seen as a terrible mistake. Woodrow Wilson was a white supremacist. He was not a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He was not a virulent white supremacist like many other people were at the time, but he still believed in white supremacy nevertheless, and he carried those views with him into the White House, segregating the federal government, of allowing Birth of a Nation to be screened in the White House, of advancing both domestic and international policies, which went against the interests of Black people and other peoples of African descent. So Wilson's racial views were made perfectly clear during his time in the White House, and Du Bois ultimately came to view him as one of the worst presidents, and certainly in modern history. I think Woodrow Wilson today is, and I think rightfully so, has been seen for how problematic his presidency was in many different avenues, many different areas, but especially in terms of race relations. So I think the kind of reckoning with his legacy is perhaps another thing that Du Bois was somewhat clairvoyant on.
Right. So, he's kind of the ultimate example, Woodrow Wilson, maybe, of this sort of theme of arrogance and hypocrisy, and this is the same experience that Du Bois is feeling and African Americans are feeling, where it's, on the one hand, we're going to go out and make the world safe for democracy, and this amazing American democratic experiment, and we're willing to go fight for it. But on the other hand, we're going to resegregate the federal government and do all those things that you listed. So and I think one of the other things that some people might point out is that Wilson contributed to the screwed up conclusion of World War I and the peace conference. And, one of the things you write about that may have contributed to this to some extent is this idea of a Pan-African conference where Du Bois is going to put together this Pan-African Congress that's going to help contribute to the peace deal. And ultimately, as you said earlier, the goal of this would be to address those underlying economic imperial exploitations that were the cause of the First World War that nobody was really talking about at the time. Right. And that ultimately, if these things aren't going to be addressed, that it's just going to lead to another war, which is exactly what happened. Yeah. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk about where he got this idea for the Pan-African Congress and why that became important to him.
Yeah. Well, Du Bois actually attends the first Pan-African Congress of the 20th century in 1900 in London, which was organized by Henry Sylvester Williams. Du Bois served as secretary for that conference. And it was actually at that conference where he first made the famous declaration that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. So his connection to the idea of a Pan-African Congress, predates World War I, but he saw the war as a particularly unique opportunity, kind of in the lines of Woodrow Wilson, to reshape the world and to make democracy a reality. Woodrow Wilson certainly did not have peoples of African descent in mind in his vision of global democracy, but Du Bois did. And he viewed the opportunity to organize a Pan-African Congress coinciding with the Versailles Peace Treaty as an opportunity to lobby the powers that be meeting at Versailles to recognize the sacrifices that Black people had made during the war, but also to address the imperial ramifications of it as well, particularly as it related to Germany's former colonies in Africa. And he believed that the Pan-African Congress, if it was fully supported and if he had the opportunity to fully make the case before the peace conference, that it would have addressed the colonial problems that ultimately led to the war and would ultimately again lead to World War II. So the 1919 conference, in many ways, he's kind of tilting against windmills. He's doesn't have a tremendous amount of support, but lays a very important foundation for future Pan-African Congresses that he is a part of in 1921, 1923, and in 1925, but also a next generation of Pan-African leaders. In 1945, another Pan-African Congress is organized in Manchester, and this is much different from the Congress in 1919 in the sense that Du Bois isn't the organizer. It's African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah who are at the forefront, George Padmore, other Black diasporic leaders who ultimately play a very important role in African liberation movements in the 1950s and 1960s. So the seeds that Du Bois lays, in 1919 ultimately bear fruit by 1945 and into the 1950s as different African countries gain their independence.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's just another area. We were saying that he was ahead of his time in so many different ways, and there he is, paving or helping to pave the way to decolonization, which of course becomes a big theme later in history. So I think hopefully we've sort of established the stakes a little bit and how important this time period was. And, he has this idea of, we're going to write this book. It's going to chronicle the experience of the Black soldier in World War One, and then slowly the book just starts getting bigger and bigger as he's realizing the connection between all these different things. The situation in Africa and global economics and future wars and democracy as a whole versus these other political systems. So he's realizing the connections between all these things, and the book is getting harder and harder to sort of pin down. I was wondering if you could talk about that process of him, trying to put this thing together and I guess ultimately never really doing it.
Yeah. Du Bois was a scholar at heart, and writing was his method of thinking. He made the decision that he was going to write the history of the Black experience in the war, and as a way to make sense of his own place in the war and ultimately what it meant on a personal level, but also on a broader historical level as well. So I think initially he was envisioning it in a very narrow sense of a kind of narrow history of the experiences of Black troops, primarily those serving in the United States Army, primarily Black combat soldiers and officers. But as the post-war years continue to unfold, and as the ramifications, the legacies of the war continue to unfold, the book keeps expanding and growing. So he begins to envision it on a broader diasporic level of incorporating the experiences of African troops serving in the French army and the English armies. He begins to think about how the experiences of African American troops connected to the larger struggles for democracy, for economic and political rights, for peoples of African descent, of thinking about what this story that he was trying to tell revealed about the state of the world and the future of the world as well. So he's really has incredible ambition for this book, and I think in part his ambitions as well as his frustrations prevent him from mustering the focus and the intellectual and even moral fortitude to ultimately complete the project.
There's parts of the book where it is a little bit morally questionable what's happening here, because he's taking, or I guess initially he asks for letters and documents and pictures from right. people, Black soldiers who served in World War One, and he's going to use them to, create the book, and he's promising that it's going to get done, this year, and then he says it'll be done by next year, and then he needs funding, and then he needs more funding, and then I was going to ask you, is this something you think about as a historian? You know, I don't know how to phrase this exactly, but a parallel might be in archaeology where
Yeah.
you find a dig site in a community of people, and by uprooting that dig site, you may be interrupting their
Yep.
their lives and their the way they go about living, and it might be spiritually or emotionally significant to them, and but on the other hand, it's important to get good history done properly. So are these
Mhm.
things you think about as a historian, and was Du Bois thinking about these as well?
Yeah, I think Du Bois's actions in trying to write his book were certainly incredibly selfish and ethically questionable, to put it lightly. It really speaks, on the one hand, to Du Bois's personality. He just had a tremendous ego. He refused to believe that he could make a mistake. He refused to believe that anyone was capable of writing the history of the war better than he could. He felt that these were materials, information that were owed to him, and that they were better in his hands than anybody else's, even the people who were the rightful owners, of it. So he was incredibly selfish, and I think that selfishness in part reflects his connection, his deep personal connection to the history of the war, and his desire to try and find some type of atonement for the decisions, for the choices that he made in supporting the war, which, as we discussed earlier, in the context of the Red Summer, the continuation of imperial exploitation, the rise of fascism in Europe, and in Asia. No, he was wrong, and he was determined to try and make sense of the war and its legacies, even if it meant engaging in some very selfish acts as it related to his research materials. Um, so I think that's really part of the story that I wanted to tell and have readers come away with, is seeing Du Bois as someone who was not perfect, someone who was capable of making poor decisions, of engaging in very selfish, self-serving activities, and kind of chipping away at, I guess, kind of the veneer of Du Bois as this kind of hollowed figure in African American history that has kind of taken on a almost saint-like status. I really wanted to present Du Bois as a human being, and someone as capable of having flaws as well.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the interesting things about the book is that, as he's pondering these massive questions of imperialism and political systems and racial oppression and how it all fits together, he's, you know, pettily responding to someone who said something bad about him.
Yeah.
In his news, and it's all, like you said, it's very human and it's very understandable. So maybe we should mention that he does have this sort of newspaper, newsletter type of thing, called The Crisis.
Mhm.
What was it, and why was it so important to him, and also why was it sort of so controversial? As far as it seems like there's a lot of infighting for control over it, and he's basing a lot of his
Right.
decisions on being able to maintain his ability to kind of post, in this newspaper.
Yeah. So the Crisis was the news magazine, the official organ of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which Du Bois founded as editor in 1910. And it was his pride and joy. I mean, he really considered himself to be the crisis, right? He was the crisis. And he felt that control over the crisis, should rest in his hands and in his hands alone. And he was constantly resisting the efforts of his colleagues on the NAACP board to kind of wrestle control away from him, for him to tone down the kind of fiery nature of the crisis. But that was the main opportunity, the main vehicle for Du Bois to reach the broader public, to reach certainly the African American public, but also to reach the Black world internationally as well. So he used that kind of as his bully pulpit to advance, to articulate his ideas on pretty much any and every issue of the day. But the crisis is also a remarkable repository of his ideas and his thinking. And I try and trace kind of through his writings in the crisis how he's thinking about the history and legacies of the war in the larger context of the struggles of Black people for equal rights and citizenship throughout the early to mid 20th century.
As you were kind of saying there, Du Bois, a lot of his sort of persona and his personality seems to be contradiction, right? Where on the one hand he's supporting World War I, and then later he's not supporting. On the one hand he believes in democracy, but on the other hand he's joining the Communist Party. On the one hand he's calling for a united front, and on the other hand he's taking shots at other leaders in the community. So how do you sort of view Du Bois's overall legacy and his overall personality, and how all that fits into how we should remember him?
Yeah, Du Bois.
I know that's a big question.
Du Bois was an artist. He was someone who was constantly experimenting with different ideas. And as you said, many of those ideas were deeply contradictory with one another. But he was always thinking about what is the best way to advance the cause of racial justice and freedom for Black people. He was deeply inconsistent in many of his beliefs and actions over his long life and career, but he remained consistent in his belief and commitment to the struggle for Black freedom, for the opportunity for Black people to live and to love and to enjoy life to the fullest extent possible. So Du Bois is certainly an incredibly complex individual. That's why there have been dozens and dozens of books written on him. And that's why there probably will still be dozens more written about him. But I think what's important to remember about Du Bois, and this is certainly what I try and do in my book, is he was someone who was not only capable of contradiction, of making mistakes, of failure even, but his commitments, his fight for Black freedom and Black equality never wavered over the long course of his life.
Right. And I think that's something that obviously is admirable about him. He just wants to make things better.
Absolutely.
And whatever that means at different times, that's what it means.
Yeah.
And that flexibility is important. So maybe last question for you, historian-based question. How do you go from an idea to like a 430 something page book? You said it earlier, it takes you 20 years or something. Would you be willing to talk about that process from just kind of having the seed of an idea to doing the research, to organizing, to thinking about it, to revising it, to writing? How does that go?
Yeah, well, I certainly didn't want to be like Du Bois and not finish my book. So that was, I think,
Right.
my main
Right.
my main motivation. Um, I think, first of all, there's the excitement of finding all these materials that Du Bois produced that no one has written about, that very few people even knew anything about. Um, so kind of getting over that initial um, thrill and kind of naivete that, okay, I'm going to be the one to bring Du Bois's unfinished, unpublished book to the world. Realizing that there's a lot of work, a lot of thinking that has to go into that. Making sure that I understood the historical context, the particular experiences of African Americans in World War One, and then, quite honestly, kind of mustering the courage to tackle Du Bois, who, as we've talked about, is just incredibly complex. It was a very daunting figure to try and get inside his head to kind of unravel the mystery of why he wasn't able to finish this book that he spent some 2 decades trying to write. Why wasn't the great Du Bois, who published 22 single authored books, unable to finish this particular book? So trying to really take that question seriously, and do the kind of painstaking research through Du Bois's materials, through his archives, the kind of voluminous records related to this project itself, as well as all of his other activities, to make sense of just why World War One was such an important moment for Du Bois, and ultimately, why he was kind of unable to complete what I think would have been one of his most significant works of history.
Right. Well, I think you did a fantastic job of writing the book, and it really was fantastic. So
Appreciate that.
Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot for coming on. Really appreciate it. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great conversation. Appreciate it.
Yep. All right. Thanks so much, man.
All
Take
right,
it
thank
easy.
you. Take care.